Thank you for joining us today. You have joined today's session in listen-only mode. Please use the chat function located on the Zoom navigation menu to ask questions to speakers and to engage in conversation today. If you have any technical issues, please privately message the host for assistance. Today's event will be recorded and available to registrants with the webinar slide deck and resources. At this time, please welcome LPI Senior Researcher, Laura Hernandez.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of our 2025 legislative prep sessions. These prep sessions are putting a spotlight on key education challenges that states face and aim to support those addressing those challenges by elevating research and real-world examples to inform evidence-based policy and practice. So before we get started today, I did want to take an opportunity to thank our amazing partners, the Education Commission of the States, the National Association of State Boards of Education, and the National Conference of State Legislatures, who are not only co-sponsors in this series, but have lent key insights into designing the sessions. And today we also have the honor of having Attendance Works as a co-sponsor and key partner. So we also want to extend our gratitude for their collaboration and the key expertise they will lend to our conversation today. So last week in our webinar series, we held 2 sessions focused on addressing teacher workforce challenges, where we looked at approaches to developing and retaining effective educators and longer-term solutions around ongoing teacher shortages. Today, our conversation shifts to a focus on the challenge of chronic absence, a concern among policymakers, practitioners, and communities alike, given the persistence of attendance challenges since the pandemic and its implications for youth learning and development. So we'll begin today with the research, noting data patterns around absenteeism, its underlying root causes, and emerging evidence of approaches and policies that stem its tide. We will then hear directly from education leaders from New Mexico and West Virginia, who will share their experiences in working to lead and support efforts to address absenteeism in their states. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the research experts we will hear from today. We are joined by Hetty Chang, the Executive Director of Attendance Works, which is a leading nonprofit working to grow field knowledge and capacity to support regular attendance and student success. And we're also happy to welcome Dr. Emily Germain, an LPI researcher who specializes in examining whole child schooling strategies and its implications for policy and practice. So with that, Hetty, take it away.
Thank you so much, Laura. What a pleasure to join you all today. So, this truly is a moment in time where we continue to have a huge attendance crisis. Before I go into talking about what that looks like, just want to make sure we're on the same page with terms. So we're going to be talking mostly today about chronic absence that's missing 10% or more of the school year due to excused, unexcused suspensions. This is really different from average daily attendance, which tends to look at how many kids typically show up each day, but can mask when individual kids are missing too much school. And it's different from truancy, which is what we have sort of 150 years of policy around, which is looking only at unexcused absences. And it tends to emphasize that if you don't show up, that's because you don't care. So we just need to sort of use the courts or blaming or threatening strategies to get you back to school because of to address those unexcused absences. And chronic absence is saying, if you miss too much school for any reason, this has an impact on your well-being, your success in school. And to address this, we really need to take a step back and find out why you're missing school, not blame, but start with problem-solving, trauma-sensitive approaches that recognize that if we want to improve attendance, we got to start by engaging kids and families as partners to understand what's going on and then address the challenges that they're facing. Improving attendance matters because we know, starting in the earliest of grades, if kids miss too much school, they're less likely to be reading by the end of 3rd grade, less likely to achieve in middle school, get suspended in middle school, and less likely to graduate from high school. But it's not just the academic challenges. When kids miss school, it affects their educational engagement, their social emotional development, even their executive functioning skills. And when you have a high level of chronic absence, it affects everyone. makes it harder for teachers to teach, kids to work in groups. You talked about before you had a webinar on teacher retention. We actually know that high levels of chronic absence lead to lower teacher satisfaction. So when you have high levels, like 20% or more levels, 20% or more of your kids chronically absent, that's when that churn is having such an effect on everyone. Before the pandemic, it was only about a quarter of all kids in a school with 20% or more levels of chronic absence. And then by 21-22, it was 2/3 of all kids in such schools. We looked at data in California. In 21-22, 75% of all schools in California had 20% or more levels of chronic absence. 22-23, it was about 68%. And right now, at the end of 23-24, it was still over half of all schools in California. This means that we have to address chronic absence because it's not only affecting the kids who are chronically absent, but all of our kids and their ability to thrive and learn. Nationwide, we went from 16 to 30% of all kids to 28%, and emerging data in 2024 shows it's still highly elevated. This is going to take our ongoing attention because while it doubled, the decrease is something that's slow. And if we want it to improve, it's going to require real intentionality and real making sure that we're taking a strategic approach using our data to figure out how to get kids back to school. And we know that while chronic absence has affected all kids, some groups of students are even more affected. Pacific Islander, Native American, kids with disabilities, African American, Latino kids, English learners. These groups of kids require us ensuring an equal opportunity to learn, we got to make sure that all kids are in school regularly. We also know that we can use data to see that we got to start this work early on because chronic absence starts really high. And then, by the way, it also starts to increase again in the secondary grades. I think what happens is that kids start getting when kids are little, all of the challenges that affect their families are affecting them. Then often attendance improves a little bit as kids get older, but then things get more challenging as kids get into middle and high school. And especially the kids who are chronically absent in the early grades, they can end up experiencing challenges because they didn't quite have the skills, the foundations they needed to be successful in middle and high school. And it starts showing up because they start missing more school. The good news is that we know how to improve this. When chronic absence reaches high levels, it really reflects an erosion in those positive conditions of learning that we know motivate kids to get to school. And we know if we put these back in place, we can get kids back to school. Kids show up to school when they know school is physically, emotionally healthy and safe. During the pandemic, we told kids stay home because school isn't the safest place for you. And now we actually have to undo that messaging. And we have to make sure all kids, when they walk into school, don't feel bullied, don't feel threatened, but feel a sense of belonging, connection, and support. And it's not just kids, but it's also their families too. We need to make sure kids feel academically engaged and challenged, and that we are investing in adults and students so that they can engage in the relationship building that is so essential to all of these positive conditions. And when we engage in relationship building, we can then do what's most key to reducing chronic absence, which is find out and address why kids might be missing too much school in the first place. And we can find out and address it both by what happens in school and by our partnerships with community organizations and public agencies. Is it barriers? Is it aversion? Is it disengagement? Is it misconceptions? because kids think that, oh, I can just make up online when that's not really true, at least for most kids. Is it because kids and families don't have access to the health care that they need? That's a barrier. Or if they are in school, they think that any symptom of illness is a reason they need to stay home. When we partner with kids and families, we can know which ones of these things are in place, and we can put in place the supports that will get all of our kids to school. This requires having a multi-tiered approach that begins with prevention, begins with making sure we have those foundational supports, because if kids don't feel a sense of belonging, connection, and then you try to message, for example, oh, we miss you and you want you here, but that's not what a kid really feels when they walk through the school building, then those attendance-related messaging or attendance-related interventions are going to fall on deaf ears. But once we have in place those foundational conditions of learning, then we can use our data to see who needs more, who needs a mentor, who needs intensive case management, because they face bigger barriers that might require additional supports to getting to school. This is about making sure that our communities and districts and states can take a systemic approach where they have actionable data, and when kids miss school, we respond with positive engagement, not blame, with strategic partnerships, with adequate and equitable resources, making sure places, particularly those struggling with poverty, have more resources to address the greater barriers that their students and families face to getting to school. This is about shared responsibility, what students, families, teachers, educators, and community partners and policymakers work on together. And it's about building the capacity to do all of this. We have issued a challenge. We know that being in school is essential. And if chronic absence almost doubled during the pandemic, what we need to do is get it back down. We can cut it by 50% in the next 5 years. And we can do that by crafting our own roadmaps that prioritize family engagement, student connectedness, relevant engaging learning, health, well-being, safety, and access to learning. And we can build those capacity and partnerships with everyone in our communities and our states to make this happen, using data to know what's working and what needs to be improved. And at the state level, we really need to make sure that we are now equipping ourselves to address chronic absence that is widespread, as well as concentrated more deeply in some of the more challenged, particularly economically challenged areas. That means making sure we have support for all districts to engage in basic messaging, to know what good practice is, and then making sure that we're prepared to add additional supports to those districts and those schools who need a bit more support. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Emily so she can talk about how this connects to the work of community schools.
Thank you so much, Hetty. Hi, everyone. A pleasure to be here to share a little bit about LPI's research, in particular, how community schools are reducing chronic absence and really embodying a whole bunch of the strategies that Hetty just outlined. So your presentation, Hetty, outlines really well that the causes of absenteeism are complex and systemic, expanding beyond the schoolhouse to the larger ecosystem in which students and families live their lives. And for this very reason, addressing these challenges piecemeal won't bring students back in the numbers that we're hoping. And so part of the solution is adopting comprehensive non-communicative approaches to addressing these underlying issues. And what we found is that community schools, the strategy that they base themselves on, and the personnel that are there and in place, make them really well positioned to do so. Our research in California and New Mexico, both states that have invested heavily in community schools and other whole child approaches, highlight that well-implemented community schools have been able to respond quickly and effectively to sharp rises in chronic absence using evidence-based strategies that are enhanced by the elements that ground community schools. Before I dive into that research and the specific strategies that were elevated, I'd like to take just a moment to ground us and a common understanding of community schools, in case you don't know. So what are community schools? They are a whole child, whole school improvement strategy for organizing the resources of the school and community around the child. And though each community school is unique and tailored to the needs of that community, LPI has worked with partners over the past several years, including the Institute for Educational Leadership, Brookings, the National Center for Community Schools, and a task force of over 400 practitioners, researchers, policymakers to establish a national definition and framework for what community schools are that builds upon the 4 pillars highlighted in LPI's research. And the latest evidence from the science of learning and development. So really thinking about those conditions for learning that Hetty alluded to in her presentation. And this framework, which is small and you won't see here, but I'm just going to quickly explain how this helps us define community schools. In the center, we're trying to create places where all students flourish in thriving school communities. And in community schools, that means that school staff and coordinators, youth and families, and key community partners are all really working together. They're literally wrapping their arms around this goal to ensure that it happens. And what really allows that to happen are trusting relationships, which is key to chronic absence, a shared vision for that school and community, inclusive decision-making and actionable data. And it's implemented through key practices. So this light blue ring is really focused on providing an integrated set of different implementation practices on the ground, including integrated systems of support, family engagement, collaborative leadership and shared voice, expanded and enriched learning opportunities, rigorous community-connected instruction, and a culture of belonging, safety, and care. So all of these working in concert to create really positive learning conditions and address some of those out-of-school barriers as well that Hetty mentioned in her presentation, that can really inhibit students from attending school regularly. So because community schools are designed to eliminate in and out of school barriers to student success and well-being, they should be, and what we found are, well positioned when well implemented to address chronic absence. And lastly, before I get into the data, I wanted to highlight, just to kind of help you understand, that there are really some key aspects of community schools that make them more effective or capable at addressing absenteeism, kind of hitting the ground running and offering potentially some lessons for schools hoping to make some of these same gains. So as I mentioned, community schools are grounded in trusting relationships. That is really the basis for making the community school strategy work, and something that they're all working on all the time. Secondly, community school coordinators are specific personnel in each community school that are a bridge between families, communities, and local partners who they put in place based on the needs of that community. So there already is a system of support in place that community schools can access quickly when they know what their students and families need. And lastly, community schools really are grounded in this actionable data that Hetty mentioned, using root cause analysis and using asset assessments to understand both the goals, opportunities, and needs in a community, and operate using this continuous improvement process where they're revisiting this and looking at data to understand and make sure that their strategy is matching what their students and community need. So they have this mindset in place to really look at data and help them make decisions on how they pivot, implement, deepen the strategy each and every year. So what did we find? We looked at, as part of a larger case study, 4 schools in California, and also profiled some community schools in New Mexico. I'm first going to talk about California. This chart shows the 4 schools that we highlighted in our report. All, once they kind of hit a spike in absenteeism, were able to either find steady declines or sharp declines in absenteeism using a number of strategies that I'll go into very shortly. And what I'd like to point out, just to celebrate, but also to see, if you look at Elk Hills, which is kind of the darkest blue line at the bottom, they were able to reduce their chronic absence rate in 1 year dramatically, but also below their pre-pandemic level. They were really, really laser focused on this piece, and are a great example of how to really use the strategy to reduce absence. In New Mexico, we profiled 3 different sites. 2 of them really started to see improvements in chronic absenteeism. So at Los Padillas Elementary School in Albuquerque, chronic absence decreased by more than half over 2 years. So even though it was, high, they were really able to make great gains in their chronic absence, and I'm sure will continue to do so. And in Peñasco, a small rural district, chronic absence decreased by 15 points in a single year and outpaced the state over that same period. And all of these community schools had dedicated personnel and structures in place to respond to their spikes in chronic absenteeism quickly, using the community school strategy in combination with some of these evidence-based strategies that Hedy shared. So let me give some examples to kind of highlight how this actually happened. So the community schools, despite being from different geographies, right? We have rural, urban, close to suburban, large districts, small districts represented here, and different states. They were all really using similar strategies across the board to build this comprehensive approach to reducing absenteeism. So the first is improving family engagement. So community schools, that is a key practice of the strategy. These schools were always hoping to engage families more and regularly by hosting community events, having really intentional greetings and conversations at drop-off and dismissal, trying to reach out with positive news, all as ways just to develop stronger, trusting relationships with families. And what I thought was really powerful is that one principal noted that trust is built through small actions over time. I think when families and caregivers identify the school as a safe, trusting place to send their kids, they're more willing to come. So these relationships and engagement allow staff to reach out to families, have conversations, and really understand what might be the problem or why a student might be missing school, and move quickly on that because they have those relationships in place. Next, these schools were all really focused on increasing student connectedness and relationship building. So post-pandemic, they noticed like a lot of kids really needed to just make friends with each other, to have some fun at school, to connect with adults, and to really make school a place they wanted to be, right? They were seeking to reinvigorate student desire to be in school. And the sites in this, they offered a number of ways to do that and facilitate friendships, including advisory groups, mentorship programs, wellness days, and a wide range of extracurricular and enrichment activities to incorporate student interests. Next, and a key piece, systemically tracking and monitoring data. All of these schools had different methods. Some use platforms, some developed their own. They all developed consistent systems for collecting, tracking, and analyzing attendance data, helping school staff to examine attendance patterns, identify students nearing or exceeding the absenteeism threshold, and then to develop targeted supports and interventions where needed. Another principal noted that on any given day, she could print out the attendance list and break down case by case why students were missing school and what they suspected the issue was. And this data then informed insights that enabled school staff to have meaningful solution-oriented conversations and interventions with students and parents. As Hedy noted, oops, I went fast, but I don't really need to give another example of this, I don't think, but all of these schools were using tiered systems of support to increase attendance, from school-wide incentive programs and messaging to really, really targeted home visit intensive supports. That was a key piece of their work. And then last but not least, these go together, leveraging partnerships to support youth and families. Community schools have partnerships in place, services and opportunities in place that are there, that the coordinator kind of helps hold, right, as a key person who is that bridge. When a student or family needs something, they know what's available and can quickly help steer that family or another school staff or personnel to know what's there to help and to move these families and help them get what they need to make sure students are at school, right? So if it is a health issue, if it is a transportation issue, maybe it is just engagement and the student needs to be connected to the right club opportunity after school. The school has these in place and has people in place to make sure that that can happen. And so to close out, I think, these community schools show how what Hetty talked about, how this strategic approach to reducing chronic absenteeism can happen when that is the way the school operates, when there's people and personnel in place, and when you're really thoughtful about who you're bringing to the school as partners, right? And all of these places were proactive, not just reactive, right? Proactive, preventative, and solution-oriented, grounded in trusting relationships, and using a lot of collaboration across the school staff, across partners and families to really stem the tide. And the last note, especially for those on the call, is all of these places were also benefiting from state support for community schools. Both New Mexico and California have grant programs, and some of these also had federal grants. So the support to put the personnel and infrastructure in place to help this was really key as well. And with that, I am going to end my presentation, pass to my colleague Robbie, who's going to help host a few questions with states that are working really hard on chronic absenteeism.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Dr. Germain and Director Chang, for your really insightful research, and excited to keep this conversation going. Very quickly, I want to introduce myself. My name is Robbie Chatterjee, and I'm a senior policy advisor here at Learning Policy Institute, where my work is focused on whole child education. So that includes community schools and improving school climate. And in light of what we just heard about the challenge of chronic absenteeism and its impact beyond just the students who are absent, and the importance of supportive whole child approaches to stem its tide, we now get to hear directly from folks engaged in doing this work in their states. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists for the next part of this discussion. And with us today, we have Michelle Blatt, who is the State Superintendent of Schools in West Virginia. And we also have John Senna, who is the Director of the Legislative Education Study Committee in the New Mexico Legislature. Superintendent Blatt and Director Senna, it's great to have you with us. So I want to start a little bit at the high level. And both New Mexico and West Virginia have taken up the charge to combat chronic absenteeism through targeted legislation. Can you each talk a bit about what your state is doing in terms of taking a whole child and holistic approach to this problem, and how these policies are working on the ground? Superintendent Blatt, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Robbie. Since I became state superintendent, and even prior to that, we've had a huge focus on the whole child and supporting our students. We like to say that every student needs one caring adult. We've heard a lot of conversation already during this webinar about the importance of relationships and supporting our students. And so when we began to really dig into our chronic absenteeism numbers, which are part of our balanced scorecard that we use for our ESSA accountability, we really began to see that we needed to put a stronger focus on how we measure this and the resources that we have in place to support our students. We have attendance directors, of course, in all of our districts. And so we started talking with them. We have a collaborative that we put together and talking with those individuals to see what we needed to do differently. And as Hetty shared, we were looking at truancy over the years, and we were looking at the excused absences versus the unexcused absences. And there was this mindset out there that was what we were, if it was excused, it was okay. And we know from the research and everything that we've seen today that is just not the case. So we started talking with our superintendents and principals and began with our Senate Education Chair and some senators on our Legislative Oversight Committee to really start talking about how can we change the narrative from truancy to chronic absenteeism. Our state code actually had excused absences listed out, all of the different things that students could be excused for. And so we started the conversation around, we need to get rid of all these excused absences and start looking at it as an absence is an absence. If they're not there, we can't teach them, we can't support them. And so as we crafted this legislation, we looked at several examples, and then we were able to embed into that our multi-tiered system of support. We had a pretty comprehensive multi-tiered system of support for academics and behavior, but we had not veered into that with attendance. And so we were able to embed into our legislation that a multi-tiered system of support would be required when addressing attendance, and really highlighting and focusing on the fact that we have to identify the root causes of why these children are not in school. Filing these truancy petitions and punishing them has not made an impact, and we've got to start looking at those different options. We hope in the this upcoming legislative session to actually tweak that legislation. At the last minute, there were a few excused absences added back in, but we were able to keep our tiered system of support language in, and we've been working diligently across the state to change those mindsets and get that conversation changed at the local level. But we would like to get those excuses out on this session that will be starting in 2025 and really continue to build upon the success that we're already seeing in decreasing those absences.
Yeah, so I think Robbie, in New Mexico, we've taken sort of an interesting approach in that we've done probably multiple things and not always in alignment with each other, but that are sort of all getting at, especially the things that Hetty mentioned earlier. So New Mexico actually passed its newest attendance legislation in 2019. Simultaneously, the state was also trying to address the rulings in a sufficiency lawsuit that said specific subgroups of students weren't being served appropriately. And so the legislature and the State Department of Education started to create new programs or adopt programs like community schools to try to address that whole child education piece. Over the last few years, we've added increased funding for career technical education. We're funding more supports for behavioral mental health for students, all of these things that would get at this whole child approach to education. I think the interesting thing for New Mexico has been that as we've rolled out additional funding, primarily in the form of grants for community schools and other kinds of programming, they are running parallel to attendance efforts. And so I know we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of some lessons learned, but part of the interesting thing here is that I think it's important that the policy piece be coupled intentionally with the programmatic pieces, right? So community schools is a great example of a whole child strategy that tries to address those root causes for attendance and other issues that we're seeing in schools. But if schools aren't intentional about using community schools potentially as an attendance intervention, if you will, or creating that welcoming environment in the school, you may not actually see that connection, or that community schools is actually trying to address attendance issues, right? So again, New Mexico has funded a lot of individual programs. We've adopted an attendance law that is very closely aligned with best practices and a lot of the things that Henny mentioned in her presentation. And I think we're at a space right now where we need to more effectively sort of connect the strategies with how they can be useful in addressing attendance issues.
Yeah. Well, it seems like both of your states are really looking at the problem head on and doing some really thoughtful work, and hopefully this can provide some lessons to other states as well. So for the next question I wanted to get into, I think there's an understanding that moving away from truancy and towards ensuring that students are getting to and wanting to be at school every day is a shift in both policy and in mindsets. So, it's a bit of a longer question, but hopefully you can get into it. Is what messaging and collaboration and negotiating was required to gain support for the attendance initiatives in your states? Maybe you can talk a little bit about, like, is there resistance that you faced and how you overcame that? So maybe Director Steino, why don't you kick us off this time?
Yeah, of course. So you're absolutely right. And I was a high school teacher and a school principal, and our traditional thinking about attendance in New Mexico, at least, involved, if students didn't come to school, we sent them a letter, right? We sent them a letter at 3 days or at 5 days or something like that. And I think parents and communities saw that as a punitive measure. And even after we passed the law, I have to say that, you know, even though I heard rumblings of attendance legislation happening at the time, I'm not sure that folks on the ground in schools were that well aware of the attendance legislation that was making its way through the legislature. And so when the legislature actually passed the law, which again is really aligned with best practices, it took a lot of communication. And this was, again, we passed our law in January of 2019. So implementation was the 1920 school year. And I just happened to be working at the state education department at the time, and would get calls from superintendents or a principal and say, well, can I still drop a kid if they miss so many days? And can I, you know, am I still sending out the letters, right? So the department had to do a much better job of communicating the changes of the law. And of course, the pandemic kind of interrupted a lot of that. And we're still in the process of helping school districts understand the framework of the law and that paradigm shift from punitive sort of blame mindset on students. And we still hear concerns about there's not enough teeth, right, in the law, but toward that proactive, welcoming, safe environment that one engages students in you know, relevant curriculum, but also addresses the need for additional supports and identifying barriers for students to come to school, and then how schools can play a role in addressing those barriers. And that's something that we're continuing to work on, and I think we'll continue to need additional messaging. And I think the other piece of it is the law was also passed without any fiscal support. So we heard very early on from schools, districts, that it sounds great in theory. Who do I get to call parents to identify barriers, or who do I get to connect them with community supports? And again, going back to that community schools conversation, that's one strategy that schools can use, right, to increase capacity at the local level, to start to get at some of those more proactive and supportive measures.
Yeah, Superintendent Blatt. Yes.
Yes, so, you know, a lot of the things that Director just spoke about concerning the letters and the way that we had addressed attendance in West Virginia are the same. One of the things that really helped us with the pushback that we were receiving from some areas was just really sharing the data of our summative assessment scores. You know, we were able to show our schools that in English and language arts, the students that were not chronically absent scored 13 percentage points higher than those that had missed the 18 or more days. In math, it was 18% higher. And so helping them to see the value of investing their time in the students being present and taking care of them, engaging them in instruction so that they want to be there, has had a great impact. And then, of course, we have been communities in schools since 2018 with an initiative from our First Lady. And part of the goals that we required each of our communities and school sites to have was an attendance goal. And so having that individual in the schools to really support that attendance goal has made a huge difference, especially as we begin to follow the impact of those that have had this program in place 3 and 4 years. And so we're consistently seeing, you know, 3-4% decreases in those numbers at those schools, where our other schools that do not have that service are continuing to rise in their chronic absenteeism numbers. And so really, I think sharing a lot of the data, and then it is in the messaging, and then also with parents. We've taken a lot of parent calls here at the Department of Education around, why won't you excuse the absence when I take my child on vacation? Isn't that educational leave? And, you know, once we explain to them that we're not worried about you taking your child out for a few days vacation, we're looking at the whole child. So we're looking to see if that child's missed 3 days, but they're still doing well in their classes. We know where the child was. There's not a concern looking at those kind of the ABCs of dropout prevention. then those are not the students we need to worry about. So really driving the message home to parents that that's what we're trying to do. And then with our teachers and staff, letting them see that you've got students that you really need to focus on and get to the root causes of what's going on to address their attendance, as opposed to just sending out those letters that I think every state did for years.
Robbie, if I could add something to that, I just to add to what the superintendent was talking about, I think there is that need to communicate very early on that the reason you include excused absences in this policy is because of the value of school, right? And so one, it's that communication with parents that, yeah, sure, a vacation is potentially educational and great. But every day that they're not in a school, they're not learning, and everybody who works in a school knows that, right? But that has to be, from the parent perspective, I think has to be communicated very clearly early on. On the school side, and this is why I mentioned career technical education early on as this whole child approach, it isn't just about support and intervention and removing barriers. It's actually creating schools as an engaging and relevant place that students want to be. And so I think the other piece of the communication to schools and school districts is assessing how you run your school actually affects whether or not students are coming, which isn't to say that it's, completely up to the school district or school to make, school the funnest place that everybody wants to be at all times. But you have to question, if students or families don't find that value in school, why is that? Why, what about the way that you run your business is also impacting whether or not folks are coming in? And I think that has to be done on the front end rather than after a school exhibits, chronic absence, or you're going to start to ping them from a state level or something like that, because it can't be, again, seen as a punitive even for a school or school district to think about. And of course, that has to be paired potentially with state support, both in terms of technical assistance, professional development, but also fiscal support to ensure that they have the capacity to do the work, right, on that back end.
Yeah. Well, I think you guys have already kind of laid the groundwork for another question I wanted to ask. So, a lot of the folks who are attending this webinar are here to learn about moving attendance policy forward in their states. So, if you could think about like what lessons and advice would you like to elevate for them? And can you share like maybe some pointers on what to do, or maybe even more importantly, what not to do in trying to move the needle in their states? So whoever wants to go first, feel free.
I think, as you said, Robbie, we have, shared a lot of those ideas maybe already, but I think one thing, thinking about that attendance collaborative that we created with 5 of our attendance directors, is we got some early adopters in. And so not only did we have the data of the chronic absenteeism to share, but we were able to share some of the successes that these early counties were having and kind of piloting these different things. Getting your students and parents involved as early as possible. It's amazing the messaging that your high school students can put out. That is phenomenal for middle school and elementary kids. So we had several counties that really jumped in and did that statewide messaging and campaign for us to really dive into, for the kids to see the importance of it from their peers. But I think, actually it's a matter of knowing that this work is worth the time and effort that it takes to put into it. This is an opportunity that we have to serve the children, to serve the whole child. And again, our Communities in Schools model enabled us to have that extra person in the schools that was looking to see what supports are in place. What does that individual family need so that that child can be in school? And just, again, really focusing in on relationships and figuring out what it is at the school level that we need to do to engage these children and to, just to promote their learning, and so that we can support them in person.
I think I'll just sort of expand a little bit on what I said earlier about sort of the order of operations for New Mexico has been mostly positive, but I think there's some pieces. So before we actually enacted what we call our Attendance for Success Act in New Mexico, the state was actually funding attendance, what we called attendance success coaches. So folks who were granted, school districts were given grants to hire folks who were supposed to support students with attendance. And one, it was a small effort at just a handful of districts around the state, and so it wasn't comprehensive. And two, it came before sort of the framework piece of why we needed those people and what their job actually was. They were being trained, but the school district was sort of seeing them in isolation, right? They had an office in a school and they were trying to address attendance issues. Then when we actually passed the law, we had an administration change at the state level and governors. And so the funding went away, but then we had the framework piece. And so we understood maybe better why we needed to do what we were doing and the more explicit tiers of support, those kinds of things. But then we didn't have the people in the school that were, sort of charged with that work. And so the first piece of it, I would say, is, and I think those conversations with school districts is going to help you assess the capacity of your state, that you don't jump ahead with policy and then put the burden on school districts to sort of implement that without the resources needed to do that. I think that's going to be really important. Again, that messaging piece is really important because people need to know why the state is doing this, right? And then I think there's one piece that we're still dealing with in New Mexico on the back end, and I think sometimes it gets an outsized amount of attention, but it's those students and families that, despite everything that a school or school district does to support them, still don't come to school, right? You've got a small percentage that you've done a lot of things and you just can't get them there. And every school knows that family, or we've heard stories, and then principals sort of joke that, oh, so-and-so's from this family, and they're just not going to come to school because we've dealt with them for 3 generations now or whatever, right? We're struggling in New Mexico still with ensuring that there are systemic supports outside of education, whether that's your state, child welfare agency, we call ours Children, Youth, and Families Department, and it's sort of the last resort at which school districts can report to another state agency that they need help with a particular family to do wellness checks or those kinds of things. And we're hearing from school districts that in those extreme cases, they're not getting the response that they think is necessary for those families and students. And so I think it's important, if you're at a state agency or at the legislature, to make those connections very explicit, and that those agencies are prepared to deal with whatever policies you put in place. Our state agencies have gotten a little bit better. They've now created specific, divisions or departments within those agencies to talk to one another, between the education agency and that child welfare agency. That's going to be critical, because what you don't want on the back end of all of this is that a principal or a school feels like they're not getting support in their most egregious cases. And unfortunately, like I said, it does get some outsized attention, and it probably provides some ammunition for scrutiny of the law overall, right? You start to forget about all those tiered supports and everything else that's going on, because you're focused on that kid that you just can't get to school no matter what you do. This feeling of hopelessness and helplessness there. So I think it's important that those structural pieces are also in place on the front end, if you can do that.
Yeah. These are really useful lessons. I think, like you said, the messaging that you're putting forward, the having all these different agencies talk to each other, breaking down those silos is really critical. So at this point, I think we are probably going to move to some questions from the audience that have been coming in. And I'd like to invite Dr. Germain and Director Chang to join us for this portion as well, so that they can offer any insights and perspectives. So one of the questions that's come in are, um, are there any ways that you've seen school leaders that have been intentionally leveraging teacher and staff ingenuity to create grassroots system change that would encourage student attendance?
I can weigh in here, and I actually feel like it's connected to what Director Senna and Superintendent Blatt were talking about. You know, one of the challenges is that when we first used to have chronic absence emerging, and it was sort of small numbers, we thought we could just hire a social worker. We could just have a small group of people addressing it. But the levels of chronic absence are so high, you really need a whole school community, particularly your teachers, the people who see kids every day being part of this work. But they can't be doing it alone or just on their own. So what I've seen is, and this is where principal leadership, I think, is especially crucial, because you have to kind of think about what this looks like in your school community. How do they make sure that teachers can build this into their daily interactions? How they greet kids, because you're going to have to greet kids some way. How they think about, as teachers, that they work together to motivate showing up to school by things like having a whole school-wide approach. So when, and this isn't always about things, it's about, oh, all the kids who show up on time, they get to be first in line for the lunch line, or they get to have lunch with their favorite teacher. But you make that so it's, you know, I've even seen schools where the teachers have figured out that the kids who are a little marginally chronic challenged, they give them roles and responsibilities in the classroom, so the kid feels a sense of belonging and wants to come. What I've seen is also when schools build this into the structure of how they operate, you make sure that you have student advisories. You make sure that you're building into the regular operations of school. You're making sure that teachers have paid time to reach out to kids and families, and making sure that every time a teacher does a parent-teacher conference, they have all the data they need to either say, hey, glad you're showing up to school and keep it up, to, oh, this is a kid who needs more challenge, and I'm going to make sure the community school social worker is there with me because this kid needs deeper support. Teachers are the front line, but we have to support them. And then hear from teachers, what are they hearing and observing? Are the challenges that kids are facing? And finding and making sure that then they can use that. One quick example would be, I was in a middle school, the principal made sure that everyone that did these things by 2x10s. You find the chronically absent kids, and you make sure that there's a staff person assigned to talk with them for 2 minutes for every single day for 10 days in a row, just to figure out what's going on. And what they realized is, particularly among 8th graders, their social studies curriculum wasn't engaging. The kids were bored. They didn't want to be there. So when they got that insight, they actually changed how they operated their teaching curriculum. We got to equip teachers to build those relationships, and then use that insight to either figure out what additional support we need, or how do we change school so it's an engaging place, which, as Director Senna said, makes kids want to be there in the first place.
Yeah. Director Chang / Hetty, I just want to, my ears perked up because you mentioned advisories, and I know what they are, but I'm wondering if you can explain just for the audience, like very briefly, what
Oh,
that system
absolutely.
looks like.
So it typically happens in middle and high schools, and it's a set period of either the week or the day where kids come in. Now, I will also say advisories are only as good as you've prepared the staff to use them. You need to make sure that staff have supports to make sure they're engaging places. There's activities where kids get to know each other. There's one middle school that I was on a webinar with, and this is from DC, where they made sure that student advisories happened every Monday. And as part of it, they took a panorama student survey where the kids could rate how much they were feeling a sense of belonging, connection, different things, and also indicate if they needed support. So every Monday there was an opportunity to check in, and if they thought a kid needed extra support, then they would make sure that kid during that time would get connected. But you're not leaving the connection between kids to kids and adults to kids to chance. You're structuring it into the way the school day is organized. And there's lots of different ways to organize them, but it has to be intentional, with intentional activities aimed at supporting kids and the relationships.
And I can just echo, so we can move on to the question, that we found that every school was doing some version of that, whether it was mentorship or mixed peer age groups with an adult in the school, or more set, grade level advisories. They all had a structured way for students and teachers to connect and find ways both to have fun, right? Like engaging activities sometimes, social emotional activities sometimes, and to have another adult who felt, who was an advocate for that student in the school that wasn't their teacher, right? That wasn't the direct person in charge of their grades and their behavior, but somebody else in the school who could be a trusted adult and advocate for them also made a really big difference.
So we have, I think, time to get into one more question. So, we talked a little bit about community school coordinators in this webinar, but I'm wondering, well, one of the questions that came in is, can you explain kind of like the persona, like the person who serves as the community school coordinator, like who they are and what's their role?
I think you want to start, Michelle? Because there's two different like similar roles, right? The full-fledged community school coordinator and the communities in schools. So maybe you share first about how communities in schools works, and then I can build on that and some of the extra things that maybe a full-time community schools coordinator would do.
Okay, so communities in schools coordinators, those are hired at the local level, and we call them site coordinators. So there's an individual in each of the schools that's purpose is to serve what we call case managed students. That person's responsible for tier 1 supports that may impact all students, individual groups of students that may be dealing with the same issue. And then of course at tier 3, those are the case managed students where they're really supporting them, whether it's with medical needs, it's academic assistance, tutoring, whatever is a barrier for that child to be successful in school, that site coordinator is there for them. And the individuals that have been hired across our state we've hired teachers, counselors, social workers from the communities that are able to pull in those community resources and know what's available to not only help support that child, but to help the school as a whole.
Yeah, and in community, like full-fledged, full community schools, the coordinator takes a little bit less of a direct case managing role and more of a leadership role where they're kind of behind the scenes, like I said, acting as that bridge, as that person who is working with students and families to elevate voice, find out what they need, what is engaging, what isn't engaging, working with community partners to see what they offer and how they can fill those needs, and then working with their school admin team to kind of coordinate that and serve on these different committees to understand how the school is operating and to help with the larger strategic picture of the community school strategy and implementation and how those pieces can and fit with understanding about both root causes of maybe underperformance or chronic absence, in addition to the high achievement goals that families and students have for themselves and for their community, and serving as that really strategic thinker and coordinator who holds that responsibility and works with school staff and admin, families and students and partners to make all of that happen.
Robbie, can I just add one thing about community schools? And I think this is a lesson we've also learned in New Mexico. Some schools are doing exactly what Emily just described, and you've got really great coordinators who are working with principals and staff and families and really sort of as that hub, right? That person who serves as that hub of coordination for all of these things. At the same time, we've also got schools that want to be that, but aren't quite sure how. And so sometimes that community school coordinator might sit in an office somewhere and they're making phone calls and they're trying their best to do all the work, but they aren't fully integrated in the school culture and as part of the team, right? And so I know this isn't a community schools conversation per se, but it's also important that that is also done intentionally, and that it isn't a sort of a siloed approach that if we just hire a community school coordinator, they'll take care of attendance for us, or they'll take care of ensuring students have meals, like those kinds of things. And so for those folks who are interested in community schools and are thinking about adopting them, it's important that that is truly an embedded piece, and to what Hetty said earlier, an intentional piece, not just maybe your state offers a grant and I need some money for another person and that would be great, so let's do that, right? It has to be really intentional and thoughtful.
Robbie, I would also just add that if, in addition to all of that integration, you have to make sure they have access to the data. Sometimes we say exist on a school, but we actually don't give them data on kids in a meaningful way so they know who missed, that they can look for patterns, that they can look for the common challenges. Our community schools can only help us to improve attendance and improve academics if we provide them with the data so that they can actually be strategic about their strategies and engage in continuous improvement.
Yeah. Well, it seems like this conversation could keep going, but unfortunately, we do have to kind of wrap it up a little bit. So I want to give a huge debt of gratitude to our researchers, our panelists. This was a wonderful presentation and a really good discussion. Clearly, we can keep doing this more in the coming year and share some of this impactful information and strategies. So thank you to everyone for joining. I'm going to kick it back to Laura Hernandez to close us out.
Absolutely. Just want to echo Robbie's thanks and gratitude for our speakers today, but as well as the contributions from folks in attendance. So thank you for the lively discussion. Please note that a short survey will be coming your way as you close the Zoom and via email. So we thank you in advance for those thoughts and feedback. And a final reminder that the fourth and last installment of this legislative prep series will take place on Thursday and will focus on emerging topics in school finance. So we hope you will consider joining us for that discussion, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.